Hello, hello, and welcome everyone. My name is Bridget Factor, nutritional therapy practitioner and yoga teacher, and I am ready to talk about blood sugars today. So this is Q&A Tuesday, and our topic today is, what does my A1c number mean? So this is a good question asked by one of our restorative wellness community members, and I wanted to address this topic because it's quite common to have elevated blood sugars or elevated A1c numbers, and I wanted to kind of explain what that meant and how you can look at it from a functional perspective. So most of us understand that having elevated blood sugars isn't a good thing, that it can potentially cause damage internally to your blood vessels and to your organs and that kind of thing, and eventually lead to diabetes. So we understand that, but the question is, how do we control it? And when our body is functioning the way it's supposed to, our body actually has very tight control over our blood sugar, and it likes to keep it in a narrow range. Some people suggest between 80 and 120 in that range, in that ebb and flow of 80 when you're having eaten in a while, 120 after you've eaten, and the body likes to keep it in that level. When we start to get outside of that range is when we can start to experience some health issues that would eventually lead to diabetes diagnosis or something like that. A large percentage of the population is pre-diabetic or diabetic, so this is actually a very common problem because of our heavy reliance on processed grains and sugars in our diet. So the way I look at a blood chemistry panel is a lot different than a way a conventional doctor would, and I look at it from a functional perspective. So I want to make sure that your body is working the way it should and support it from that perspective, instead of waiting till you reach an X level and receive a diagnosis. So that's the difference between a functional perspective and a conventional perspective. But there's two numbers that are typically looked at. One is your fasting blood glucose, and one is your hemoglobin A1c levels. So your fasting blood glucose is the measure of glucose in your blood after you haven't eaten for a while. So when you go in and first thing in the morning and you haven't eaten, it's probably been about 12 hours since you've had any food, and they call that fasting, and they take your blood sugar level, and we want that level to be in the 80 to 95 window. That's a good number to be in the morning when you haven't eaten for a while. I don't know if you can hear my kitty cat. He is wanting to contribute his opinion about this. So in the other number that we look at is the hemoglobin A1c, which tells us not just a snapshot in time of what your blood sugar is, but what your average blood sugar is over the course of about 120 days. And so what does that mean? What does hemoglobin A1c mean? It's actually looking at your red blood cells, the hemoglobin in your bloodstream, while it's circulating through your bloodstream with some glucose. The glucose can attach to it. You can think of it like sugar is sticky, and it'll stick to a protein in your blood. And when the glucose attached to it, it's called glycated hemoglobin. And there's different forms of glycated hemoglobin. There's a type A of hemoglobin, and then there's subtypes of type A. So there's A1b, A1c, etc. But by looking at this particular subtype, we can correlate the average blood glucose that you have had over the course of the past 120 days, because typically those hemoglobins have a life of 120 days. So it gives us a better snapshot of how well controlled your blood sugars are. And a functional range that we want to aim for is between 4.8 and 5.7. That nice tight little window tells us we're keeping our blood sugars steady in that 80 to 120 range most of the time. And so if we get a little bit lower number than that, we can look into possible hypoglycemia, either reactive hypoglycemia, or just overall not getting enough carbohydrate to support your needs. Reactive hypoglycemia is actually quite common. This is where you eat a little more carbohydrate than your body can handle, and it causes an elevated insulin, and the elevated insulin then brings down your glucose level faster than normal, and it's sort of like a reactive response to having such a high insulin level or high glucose level in your blood, and that reactive response precipitates the blood glucose drop, so your blood sugar actually drops below 80. So that's gonna be when you feel shaky or hungry, or you get a headache, or you're very angry before a meal, or a couple hours after a meal if your blood sugar drops too low. And so if that is happening, then we know that we don't have good control over our blood glucose, and we need to moderate our carbohydrate intake and balance it with our proteins and fats, so we can stay in that nice steady window of 80 to 120. If our hemoglobin A1c numbers get above that range, like above 5.7, then we're starting to creep into pre-diabetes, and that is a red flag that our blood sugars aren't able to come back down after we eat into that normal window, that our blood sugars are staying too high, above that 120 range for too long. And so the average of that A1c level is increasing. And when we get into that range, most conventional doctors will say that your number is normal, to be careful, maybe you need to watch your diet, etc. I've had this happen to me, when I've had blood sugar issues and have dealt with diabetes in the past, and you're sort of in that area of you're not quite diagnosed with diabetes, but we know you have blood sugar problems. And from a functional perspective, when you start to get outside that range, we want to start addressing the issue so you don't develop diabetes in the future, and you don't develop those problems in the future, instead of waiting year after year as your numbers creep up, little by little by little, to the point where then you're put on medicine. The idea from a functional perspective is to address that on the front end before you require medication. And the way that I approach that is through a sugar controlled diet, where we're really limiting refined sugars, basically no refined sugars, where we're limiting refined carbohydrates, we're dramatically limiting grain intake, and starch intake. So anything that is quick absorbing carbohydrate, because starch is essentially just a long chain of glucose that by the time it reaches your blood sugar, it's glucose. So it's still having the same effect on your system. And you also have to be aware of fruit intake as well, because that can have an impact on your blood sugar. So limiting fruit, going with lower sugar fruits like berries instead of the higher sugar fruits, and really limiting your grains and no refined carbohydrates whatsoever, and following that plan to help get those blood sugars back in balance. It's also important to make sure you're including protein and healthy fats. Fats help slow down the release of blood sugar into your bloodstream, so you don't have as drastic of highs, which precipitate that reactive hypoglycemia. So that is something that you want to be aware of. The other thing that we know is stress, and I always like to emphasize the importance of stress management, no matter what approach you're taking, is when you're under stress, that signals your adrenals to release cortisol, which signals your liver to release sugar, because your body is thinking, I need to release my reserves to have the energy to escape whatever threat that I'm under. So stress will increase your blood sugar levels, even if you're just following a very simple diet, a very moderate to lower carb diet. Stress can increase your blood sugar levels, so that's something to be aware of as well. And it will exacerbate the blood sugar roller coaster that you may be riding. So that does play a role as well. So it's not just about diet, but it's also about lifestyle. Exercise is a great way to, one, relieve stress, and two, use up that glucose so you don't have it lingering around, and also to help improve insulin sensitivity so that your cells can actually use the glucose that you are eating. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of give you an overview about what those numbers mean and how a functional practitioner will look at them differently than a conventional doctor, and give you some ideas on how to start helping bring those numbers back into balance. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Please comment on this video and let me know what you think. Ask any questions that you may have. And I just really appreciate you watching, and thank you for being a part of the restorative wellness community. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.